The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's ICU hum at exactly 440 Hz, a frequency that most people stop hearing after 3 minutes. Sarah Chen has heard it for 12 years, which means she stopped hearing it approximately 11 years and 51 weeks ago. She moves through the corridor at 0312 hours, her badge clipped to navy scrubs that smell faintly of the industrial bleach used in the laundry on the basement level. The combat boots in her locker still have sand in the treads. Nobody has asked why. Her hands are steady as a surgical laser as she reviews the medication log for room 347, the patient with the failing kidneys who'd been admitted 72 hours earlier. The charting is immaculate on the surface, which is precisely why the discrepancies make her pause. Morphine for milligrams for documented at 1847 hours. But the patient had been in imaging until 1920. She traces the entries backward, her left hand trembling slightly as she writes the question mark in the margin. That's the shrapnel damage, 12 years, and the tremor still shows up when she concentrates. She'd learned long ago to write fast enough that people mistook it for cursive. The ICU smells like antiseptic burn and something else underneath. Copper. Old copper, the way dried blood smells when it's been on concrete for 3 hours. Sarah's olfactory system recognizes it before her conscious mind does, and her body doesn't react. No widened pupils. No adrenaline spike. No reaching for a tourniquet that isn't there. She simply turns the page and keeps reading. Dr. Hargrove hasn't arrived yet, which means she has approximately 43 minutes before the morning rounds begin at 0400. He arrives exactly at 0357 every day, his designer watch, $12,000, Omega Seamaster, the kind that costs more than her monthly rent, hitting the timestamp with ritualistic precision. She knows this because she's been observing patterns for 6 months, which is what people with 12 years of military reconnaissance training do when they're supposedly just a night shift nurse. The medication discrepancies in room 347 aren't random. They're systematic. $4,200 in phantom dosages over 18 months, which means someone has been logging medications that never made it to the patient's full line. The money travels somewhere. Shell companies have Sarah's attention now, the way IEDs used to have her attention, the way anything that could kill people quietly always gets her attention. She's reviewing the pharmacy delivery logs when the trauma alert chimes through the overhead speaker at 0336. The sound cuts through the ICU like a blade. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Gunshot wound, male, 34, ETA 4 minutes. The nurses around her move with practiced urgency, but Sarah is already on her feet before the announcement finishes. Her movements are economical, efficient, the way soldiers move when they've trained to not waste energy on anything unnecessary. Room 347's patient is already stable, so she doesn't stop to check on him. Instead, she walks toward Trauma Bay 4, where the attending physician is barking orders to residents who still look nervous about critical procedures. This is where Sarah should stay invisible, just another night shift nurse helping with the inflow. But when she reaches the bay, the patient is being unloaded from the ambulance, and the first thing she sees is the entry wound in his left chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. The air is collapsing his lung from the inside, pressure building against his heart. He has maybe 90 seconds before his blood pressure drops so low that they lose him on the table. The attending is still reviewing imaging. The residents are frozen in that moment where they know something is wrong but their training hasn't caught up to their instincts. Sarah doesn't raise her voice. She simply moves to the bay, her hands already reaching for the needle decompression kit before anyone can hand it to her. 14-gauge angiocath. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, she says, and her voice sounds like it's coming from somewhere very far away, or very deep inside the ground. The attending turns toward her, about to tell her to step back, but something in her positioning, the way her shoulders are set, the way her eyes have gone completely flat and focused, makes him hesitate. Her hands move through the procedure with zero hesitation. The needle goes in at the precise angle. The hiss of air escaping the pleural cavity is immediate and audible. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping toward critical, stabilizes at 88%. Then 92. Her movements are the movements of someone who has done this in conditions that would make the sterile environment of a trauma bay feel like luxury. The resident who'd been standing frozen steps closer, staring at her hands. His name tag says Mitchell, and he looks like he's trying to solve an equation. That's a combat medic technique, he whispers. Not a question. Sarah doesn't acknowledge him. She's already moving toward the suction, her attention on the patient's airway, her hands steady as they work. The attending physician is watching her now, and she can feel the weight of his attention like pressure against her back. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't acknowledge it. She simply continues the procedure with the kind of competence that leaves no room for questions. The patient stabilizes. By 03:44, his O2 is 96%, his blood pressure is coming up, his pupils are reactive. Sarah steps back from the table and sets down the instruments with the care of someone handling something sacred. She moves toward the sink to wash her hands. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and she can hear the monitor beeping its steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Normal sinus rhythm. Good work, the attending says quietly, not looking at her, because acknowledging her too directly would mean asking questions about where a night shift nurse learned trauma medicine that advanced. Sarah nods and walks back toward the medication logs. She doesn't rush. She doesn't seek praise. She simply returns to the work that needs doing, her hands already back to their slight tremor, her eyes already back to their practiced invisibility. By 03:57, when Dr. Hargrove arrives, he will find her exactly where he expects her to be, at the nurse's station, reviewing charts, asking the kind of quiet questions that nobody important thinks matter. He walks in at 03:58, his watch chiming 1 minute before rounds. His name is Richard Hargrove, and he has been inflating billing codes at Mercy General for exactly 18 months and 4 days. He has a brother-in-law in the insurance industry, and that brother-in-law has connections that run all the way to the state licensing board. He has 3 emergency room physicians who owe him favors. He has a structured settlement that moves money through a company called Pacific Wellness Consulting, which doesn't exist except on paper and in the offshore accounts that allow him to maintain a house in La Jolla that costs more than most people's entire lives. He does not, however, have any idea who the woman at the medication log is. Sarah feels him arrive before she sees him. It's not a supernatural thing. It's pattern recognition. The way the air pressure changes when someone walks into a space with absolute confidence in their power. The way the junior residents suddenly straighten their posture. The way the ICU, usually a place of careful chaos, becomes a place of careful order. "Good morning, team," Dr. Hargrove says, his voice smooth as hospital-grade lubricant. He's reviewing the patient list on the electronic board, his eyes passing over the names like a man reading headlines he's already decided don't matter. He sees Sarah at the desk. He sees her bent over the medication logs. He sees a woman in her late 30s, hair pulled back, Asian, moving slowly through data with the kind of focus that suggests she might not have much else going on. He does not see what his subconscious mind briefly registers, the way her shoulders are positioned, the way her eyes track movement across the room even though she appears to be looking at a chart, the way her breathing pattern doesn't change despite the elevated cortisol he just caused in the building. "How's room 347 looking?" he asks the resident standing nearest to him. He's already turning toward the patient rooms, already moving through his day the way he moves through everything, as someone fundamentally unconcerned with any observation that doesn't directly affect him. "Stable," the resident says. "Clear lung fields. Vitals are solid." Dr. Hargrove nods, and his attention moves on. But Sarah has already registered that he glanced at room 347's medication log from a distance, that his eyes lingered for exactly 2.3 seconds on the line where she'd noted the discrepancy, and that his shoulders tensed infinitesimally before he redirected his focus. She logs this information the way she used to log intel in briefing rooms, the way her brain was trained to log it, thoroughly, silently, with absolute certainty. The rounds begin at 0400 sharp. Dr. Hargrove moves through the ICU with the kind of presence that makes people speak in lower voices, choose their words more carefully. He has opinions about everything. He questions every medication selection, every monitoring choice, every clinical decision that wasn't his. But his questions are articulate. They're rooted in plausible reasoning. He sounds like someone who cares deeply about patient safety, which is precisely why nobody in his presence questions whether he might have other motivations. When they reach room 347, Sarah stands to the side, her chart in her hands, her posture the posture of someone trying to occupy as little space as possible. This is the persona she's perfected over 6 months. Invisible. Deferential. Quiet. The kind of nurse that residents don't make eye contact with because they've been trained to make eye contact with the doctors. The morphine administration looks a little off here, Dr. Hargrove says, tapping the chart with his pen. He's looking at the exact line where Sarah noted the discrepancy. Looks like there's a documentation error. Probably just the overnight staff being sloppy. He doesn't look at Sarah, but his voice carries a very specific kind of inflection. The kind that makes you aware that he's aware of your presence even though he's not acknowledging it. Sarah doesn't react. She doesn't defend the charting. She doesn't explain that she documented her observation because that's what protocols require. She simply waits, her face arranged in the expression of someone who has learned that speaking is often more dangerous than silence. These night shift people, Dr. Hargrove continues, his voice pitched to the residents as if Sarah isn't standing 3 feet away. They come in thinking they understand critical care, but they're usually just working the night shift because they can't cut it during the day. No disrespect to the night staff, of course. His smile is perfect. His tone is concerned. He sounds like someone who is looking out for patient safety rather than someone who is casually undermining a colleague's credibility in front of an audience of junior physicians. One of the residents shifts uncomfortably. The other one has already learned to follow Dr. Hargrove's lead and doesn't meet Sarah's eyes. I'll review the medication documentation personally, Sarah says quietly. Her voice is the voice of someone trained to speak into radios that carry across desert distances, but she scaled it down to barely above a whisper. 10 years ago, she could have projected it through a sandstorm. Right now, she's using it to speak in a way that requires people to lean in to hear her. I have questions about the billing codes as well. The correlation between documented doses and pharmacy delivery doesn't match the patient invoicing. The words hang in the air like something solid. Dr. Hargrove stops walking. He turns, slowly, to look at her directly for the first time. His expression is still pleasant, but something behind his eyes has shifted. Something has understood, on an instinctual level, that this quiet woman has identified a problem that he has spent 18 months building. I'm sure there's a simple explanation, he says smoothly. These billing discrepancies are usually just administrative oversights. The pharmacy system hasn't been updated in 7 years. Easy to get confused. He's already turning away, but his movements are less fluid now. There's a calculation happening behind his posture, the way a predator recalculates when it suddenly recognizes that what it thought was prey might have teeth. The rounds continue, but something has changed in the ICU's atmosphere. The fluorescent lights seem to buzz a little louder. Sarah returns to the medication logs, and she can feel Dr. Hargrove's attention like a weight on her back, even though he doesn't look at her again. He spends the remainder of rounds asking his questions, but his questions have changed. They're sharper. They're designed to challenge, to question, to make the staff around him feel less certain about their own judgment. By the time rounds end at 0 for 47, Sarah has already documented her observations in 7 different places: the medication log, the pharmacy cross-check system, her personal notes, the clinical incident reporting database, and 3 email drafts to the nursing supervisor that she hasn't sent yet. She works quietly, methodically, the way someone trained in reconnaissance works. She collects data. She documents patterns. She waits for the moment when the pattern becomes undeniable. She doesn't know yet that Dr. Hargrove has already made his first phone call, that he's already activated the first of 3 backup plans, that he's already begun calculating which allies at Mercy General might help him discredit a night shift nurse who has somehow managed to see through the structure he's spent 18 months building. But she will know soon. For now, she simply returns to room 347 and checks the patient's vitals. The heart monitor beeps its steady rhythm. The 4 medications flow at their prescribed rates. The patient rests comfortably under careful observation, completely unaware that 2 people in this hospital have just identified each other as threats. Sarah adjusts the monitoring leads and moves on to the next patient, her hand steady, her presence invisible, her attention absolute. In 38 minutes, her shift will end. In 2 hours, the day staff will arrive and everything will change. The catheter was halfway out when Dr. Hargrove pushed through room 347's door like a man arriving at his own courtroom. Sarah's hands were steady, gloved, moving the silicone tube through the patient's central line with the precision that came from a decade of field medicine, but Hargrove didn't see competence. He saw a target. "Stop! Stop!" His voice had the texture of gravel in a blender, loud enough that nurses in the hallway turned toward the sound. "You've just contaminated the entire sterile field." The patient's wife, a small woman with silver hair pulled tight as a fist, froze mid-breath. Their 2 adult sons, built like dockworkers, straightened in their chairs. All of them staring at Sarah like she'd just dropped a scalpel into an open chest. Sarah's hands went still. The catheter hung between her fingertips. She didn't look at Hargrove. She looked at the sterile field, untouched, perfect, exactly as it had been for the last 3 minutes. "Doctor, I maintained sterility throughout the—" "Don't argue with me, Nurse Chen." Hargrove's face was flushing now, that particular shade of red that came with the intoxication of authority. "I've been practicing medicine since before you could spell anatomy." He turned to the family with a smile that looked rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. "I sincerely apologize for this lapse in competence. We'll have a properly trained nurse complete this procedure." The implication hung there, thick as humidity. Sarah wasn't properly trained. Sarah wasn't competent. Sarah didn't belong. 1 tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She wiped it away with the back of her gloved hand without breaking eye contact with the old woman watching her. The wife's expression shifted, confusion melting into something harder. Recognition, maybe, of what a lie looked like when it wore a white coat. Sarah's voice came out quiet. "Level." The kind of level that meant she'd already calculated 17 different responses and chosen to say only the truest thing. "I've closed chest wounds in conditions you couldn't imagine, doctor, so perhaps focus on your own competence." The air in room 347 changed pressure. The machines beeped their indifferent rhythm. Hargrove's face went from red to something approaching purple, not from shame, but from the shock of a nurse, a woman, in front of his captive audience, suggesting that he, Dr. Adrian Hargrove, might have competence issues. He left without another word. The family stayed silent for 6 full seconds. Then the eldest son said, quietly, "I believe that." His mother nodded. Sarah changed gloves, re-prepped the sterile field, which had never been contaminated, and finished the catheter placement while the monitors sang their mechanical lullaby. But the damage was done. The next morning at 0630, Sarah pushed through the break room door expecting coffee and maybe 5 minutes of stillness before the day shift arrived. Instead, she found the disciplinary board. Her name posted in permanent marker, visible to every staff member in Mercy General's ICU. Violation, compromised sterile technique, argumentative conduct, insubordination toward attending physician. 3 nurses sitting at the table, Angela, Martinez, and the new grad Lisa, suddenly remembered critical things they needed to do elsewhere. Angela's coffee was abandoned mid-sip. Martinez grabbed a folder that had nothing to do with her assignment. They scattered like birds from a rifle shot. Sarah poured coffee from the pot that tasted like burnt regret and sat down alone. By afternoon, Hargrove had weaponized a code. Sarah was helping with a patient deterioration in bay for when his voice cut through the controlled chaos. "Little Miss Textbook, hand me the crash cart, would you?" The phrase was casual. Devastating. A resident snickered. Sarah didn't respond. She handed him the crash cart, stepped back, and made herself smaller. Invisible again. That evening, Hargrove sat in his private office on the 3rd floor, Sarah's personnel file open on his mahogany desk. The paper was thin, almost translucent from age. Her employment history was sparse, 2011 to 2023, there was nothing. A gap. A void. 12 years of her life erased or hidden or sealed behind something. Her nursing degree from UCSD was legitimate, but her references before that were vague at best. Military service record, he saw the notation, but the details were redacted, classified, stamped with warnings he wasn't authorized to access. He picked up his office phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. The voice on the other end belonged to Robert Chen, a board member with hospital connections and a mortgage that Hargrove had helped him refinance at a rate that was probably illegal. Bobby. Adrian. Listen, I need a favor. Personnel matter. One of our night shift nurses is raising questions about billing codes, medication logs, compliance issues. Hargrove's voice was smooth as fresh tar. Her credentials are suspicious. I need someone to quietly ask the state licensing board about her record. Verify her qualifications. Standard background audit. Shouldn't take long. The silence on the other end lasted 2 seconds. Then, I'll make a call. Hargrove hung up, leaned back in his leather chair, and made himself a mental note. The nurse would be neutralized within a week. Reassigned, probably. Fired, ideally. Certainly not in a position to ask any more questions about room 347, about medication pumps at 3 in the morning, about insurance codes that didn't match actual patient care. He didn't know yet that in 38 minutes, his careful universe was going to crack. 2 nights later at 2,347 hours, the ER phone rang on the unit while Sarah was charting vitals. The voice on the other end was rapid, controlled, trained for crisis, ICU, this is ER. Incoming GSW, military patient, 9 entry wounds, BP 60 over palpable, ETA for minutes. Rolling directly to Trauma Bay 2. Prepare for massive transfusion protocol. The line went dead. Sarah's hands went into motion before her brain caught up. Massive transfusion protocol. 9 bullets. Military patient. The numbers stacked like bricks, and somewhere in the stacking, her body remembered things her mind had spent 12 years trying to bury. The stretcher arrived with Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 34 years old, bleeding crimson from chest, abdomen, left thigh. His eyes were still alert, shock hadn't claimed him yet, but the math was simple and terrible. 9 entry wounds. No visible exit wounds. The bullets were still inside him, doing damage with every beat of his failing heart. The trauma resident, Dr. Patel, young, competent but terrified, stood frozen at the foot of the gurney, staring at the volume of blood like it was a language he'd forgotten how to read. The surgical resident looked to the attending. The attending looked to Dr. Patel. Nobody moved. Sarah was already moving. Her hands were steady as surgical steel, her voice calm as a medevac in the eye of a sandstorm. Tension pneumothorax, right side. Palpate with me. Feel that? The tracheal deviation? She didn't wait for confirmation. She was prepping the decompression kit, 14-gauge angiocath, chest wall marked at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers finding the exact anatomy without hesitation because this wasn't a textbook procedure anymore. This was muscle memory. This was Sanjin Valley, 2019. This was saving a patrol that shouldn't have survived a Taliban ambush. The needle went in with the kind of confidence that made other people confident. Air hissed, that singular sound of pressure releasing, of a lung finally able to breathe, of 600 milliliters of trapped air escaping into the room like an exhalation from God. Webb gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed. 71. 78. 85. Dr. Patel stared at Sarah's hands like they'd just performed a miracle and were about to perform another. His mouth opened. Closed. Then, barely audible. That technique. Kandahar, 2019. There was a combat medic, they called her Phantom. Saved our entire patrol with exactly that placement, under mortar fire, with one hand while returning fire with the other. I was a junior enlisted then. I've never forgotten it. Sarah's eyes flashed to Patel. To Webb. To the trauma team gathering around them. She saw it happen, the recognition traveling through the room like electricity through water. The slight widening of eyes. The almost imperceptible shift in posture as people suddenly recalculated who they were standing next to. 2 units O negative and get me a surgical team. Right now, Sarah said, her voice deliberately flat, deliberately professional, deliberately not allowing even a whisper of the past to color the present. This patient is going to the OR in 4 minutes or he's dead in 5. The trauma bay exploded into motion. Orders. Responses. Blood products. Monitoring. The organized chaos of people who suddenly understood they were in the presence of someone who knew something true about death and survival that most people only read about in after-action reports. Webb made it to surgery. His blood pressure stabilized. His core temperature was salvageable. Sarah scrubbed his blood from under her fingernails in the locker room at 0400, staring at the pair of worn combat boots sitting in the bottom of her metal locker, boots that had walked through Ramadi, boots that had been there for 12 years, boots that were supposed to remain hidden. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby. The hospital was nearly silent. And in that silence, one sentence repeated in Sarah's mind, Dr. Patel's voice carrying a weight that no one in Mercy General was supposed to carry. Phantom. They called her Phantom. Her invisibility had lasted exactly 3 minutes. The ER doors burst open at 2,347 hours. 1 stretcher. 1 patient. 9 bullet wounds. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Webb came through Mercy General's trauma bay like a shattered engine block, his flight suit dark with blood that had stopped looking like blood somewhere over Arizona. The trauma team moved in synchronized chaos, cutting away fabric, calling out vitals, a resident barking type O negative, massive transfusion protocol, get vascular on the phone. Sarah stood at the edge of the bay, watching the controlled violence of emergency medicine. Webb's left lung had collapsed somewhere over the Nevada desert. His blood pressure read 60 over palpable. His abdomen was rigid. Peritoneal bleeding. Multiple GSWs through the lower torso, upper left quadrant, right flank. The kind of damage that made surgeons call time of death before they even opened the OR. But Marcus Webb didn't die. Somehow, impossibly, the surgical team reconstructed him through 5 hours of meticulous violence, clamping bleeders, resecting necrotic bowel, packing the abdominal cavity with gauze because they ran out of time for anything more elegant. When he rolled out of the OR at 0417 hours, his chest rose and fell on the ventilator's rhythm alone, and his BP finally climbed above 90. Sarah volunteered for every shift in room for 12. The attending nurse coordinator raised her eyebrows. Chen, you're already pulling doubles. He needs consistency in his post-op monitoring. That wasn't why. The moment the trauma resident had whispered those words, Kandahar, 2019, your Phantom, Sarah's carefully constructed invisibility had begun to unravel. She needed to know if Webb remembered. She needed to know if his broken body held the one person who could confirm the ghost that had just walked out of her chest decompression technique. The first night post-op, Webb slept under propofol and morphine, his vitals stabilizing on the ventilator. Sarah checked his lines at 2,300 hours, triple lumen central catheter, Foley catheter draining burgundy urine, chest tube bubbling steadily with the small pneumothorax they'd managed to contain rather than eliminate. His blood pressure had climbed to 94 over 52. Not good, but not dead. She adjusted his fluids by 20 milliliters per hour. Standard post-trauma ICU protocol. At 0300 hours, she entered room for 12 for vitals check and found Dr. Hargrove standing over Webb's bedside with a phone flashlight, one hand on the 4 pump. Doctor? He jumped. Actually flinched. His jaw tightened before his expression smoothed into professional concern. Titrating his pain management, Hargrove said, "The post-op protocol requires careful dosing." But Sarah had 23 years of medical training, 12 of them at levels that made hospital nursing look like reading picture books. She saw the billing tablet on the overbed table. She saw the documentation already entered into the chart on his phone screen: extended ventilator protocol, 6 days. Specialized hemodynamic monitoring equipment. A second chest tube. Procedures that hadn't been ordered, hadn't been performed, but were already logged in Mercy General's billing system as completed services. Those aren't pain meds you're logging, doctor. His eyes met hers. The fluorescent light above the bed made his pupils look like dots of ink. Are you questioning my clinical judgment again, Nurse Chen? Because the board is already reviewing your credentials. He smiled without warmth. That employment gap between 2011 and 2023 seems significant. You might want to focus less on my decisions and more on explaining where you actually were for 12 years. He left the room. The door hissed shut behind him. Sarah stood at Webb's bedside, listening to the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm, watching the 4-pump drip morphine at exactly the rate the patient actually needed. Not the rate Hargrove was billing. By 03:47 hours, Hargrove had filed a formal complaint with the chief nursing officer. By 0400 hours, he'd activated a call chain, 3 phone calls to board members who owed him favors, a second formal request to the state licensing board requesting full credential verification, a request for an outside consultant to review her patient care decisions from the past 6 months. Sarah learned about it when the CNO called her in at 0600 hours, before the sun crested the hospital parking lot. Sarah, sit down. Chief Nursing Officer Patricia Valdez gestured to the chair across from her desk. Her voice carried the tone of someone about to deliver bad news with sympathy. Dr. Hargrove has raised concerns about employment documentation. Specifically, there's a 12-year gap between your listed service as a field nurse from 2011 to 2023. No hospital records, no clinics, no references, nothing. I was in private medical consulting, Sarah said quietly. That's the problem, no documentation exists for private consulting either. No contracts, no invoices, no way to verify you were actually employed. Valdez folded her hands. Sarah, this is serious. The state licensing board is asking for complete documentation of every clinical hour you've worked in the past 14 years. If you can't provide it, we're facing a potential license suspension pending investigation. Sarah's throat didn't tighten. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling that nobody saw was restraint, pure, surgical restraint. The kind you learn when you're field dressing a GSW while rounds land 200 meters away. How long do I have? 72 hours to provide complete records or you're suspended from patient care. The military had ordered her to disappear. After Operation Copper Valley, after the mission that never happened in the country that wasn't officially involved, the Pentagon had scrubbed her service record and told her that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was legally dead. Those 12 years were encrypted in files that didn't exist, housed in a building that had no name on any map, reviewed by people who couldn't acknowledge her existence without committing treason. She couldn't produce documentation for years that weren't supposed to exist. But Webb was still alive in room for 12. Webb was critical but stable, his blood pressure climbing slowly, his urine output trending better, his consciousness beginning to surface under the edges of sedation. And Hargrove was preparing to fabricate his recovery timeline, billing insurance for procedures that would never happen, turning a genuine trauma into a revenue stream. Sarah returned to room for 12 at 0800 hours for her shift. Webb's eyes were barely open, pupils blown wide from medication, but they tracked toward her when she entered. She checked his lines with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this in field hospitals under fire. Morning, Lieutenant. His lips moved. No sound. The ventilator breathed for him, that mechanical hiss like wind through a canyon. You're at Mercy General Hospital in San Diego. You're post-op from catastrophic GSW injuries sustained in Ramadi. You've got a collapsed lung we're managing with conservative chest tube placement, peritoneal bleeding we've packed, and about 14 hours of serious pain ahead of you before the medications start making sense again. She adjusted his propofol drip. You're going to be fine. You're tougher than your injuries. His eyes closed. That was when the second night shift nurse, a resident named Marcus Holloway who'd been shadowing the ICU rotation, stepped back from the monitor station where he'd been watching her work. His face had gone pale. He was staring at her chest, or specifically, at the pair of combat boots laced together and hanging from a carabiner on her duty bag in the corner of room for 12. "Where did you get those?" His voice was barely a whisper. Sarah didn't look at him. She continued adjusting Webb's fluids as if he hadn't spoken. "I know those boots. I know the way they're laced. I know the sand that's still in the soles." Holloway stepped closer. "Kandahar. 2019, your patrol got ambushed in the Sanjan Valley. You held off 3 Taliban fighters with an M16 and medical tape until the quick reaction force got through the valley." Sarah's hands didn't pause. Steady. Controlled. The hands of someone who'd closed chest wounds in conditions that would have broken any civilian nurse into a dozen pieces. "You extracted 3 of us out of that compound. One of them was bleeding out from a femoral artery injury, and you ran 200 meters across open ground to get to him." Holloway's voice cracked. "You're Phantom. You're the combat medic we've been hearing stories about for 5 years. You're the one who saved Webb's entire patrol when the air support couldn't get there." Sarah looked at him. Just looked. Her eyes were the color of someone who'd seen the worst humanity could do and chosen to save people anyway. "I don't know what you're talking about, Resident Holloway." "Then why are you here? Why are you working a night shift ICU job under a different name in San Diego?" He gestured at Webb. "He's one of ours. The entire team would walk through fire for you, and you're working under an alias, letting that bastard Hargrove." "Get some rest," Sarah said quietly. "You're seeing things that aren't there." But they both knew what he'd seen. And they both knew that inside room for 12, a Navy SEAL was breathing on a machine that would keep him alive, and somewhere in Ramadi or Kandahar or Fallujah, his brothers in arms were going to learn that their Phantom wasn't dead. They were going to learn she was real. And they were going to come. The anonymous complaint arrived at the hospital board's email at 03 for 7 hours, routed through a personal account Hargrove had set up for exactly this purpose. By 0600, he was making calls. The first went to a board member whose daughter had received a full scholarship to UCSD Medical School through a grant Hargrove had quietly facilitated. The second call reached a cardiovascular surgeon who'd been referring all his complex cases to Hargrove's billing network for 18 months. The third was to the hospital's chief financial officer, the one person who understood how much Hargrove's kickback schemes had padded the hospital's bottom line. 3 calls. 3 men who understood the language of reciprocal obligation. By breakfast, the state licensing board had received an inquiry about employment gaps in the credential file for one RN Sarah Chen, requesting immediate documentation of all 12 years of professional work history. By lunch, an outside consultant had been hired to review her patient care decisions. The file would be flagged for investigation. Her credentials were about to be scrutinized with a microscope. Hargrove knew she couldn't possibly survive, because she couldn't explain where she'd been, what she'd done, or why none of it officially existed. Sarah didn't know about any of it yet. She was focused on Webb, on his chest tube output and his oxygen saturation and the way his vitals had stabilized into something that looked like survival. 48 hours post-admission, he was breathing on his own, extubated, asking for water. She was changing the dressing on his primary wound when she noticed him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain. "You need rest," she said quietly, not looking up from the sterile field. "So do you." His voice was hoarse. "But you won't take it." She finished the dressing and turned to leave. She had 4 hours left on her shift. She would go home and sleep and come back because Webb needed someone who understood what those bullets meant, what surviving them required, and what the nightmares would cost him. But she wouldn't make it to her car. At 2,213 hours on the second night post-admission, the ICU had that particular quality of quiet that comes when you're short-staffed on a night shift and everyone is either sleeping or pretending to be. Sarah was checking the chest tube drainage in room for 12 when the doors at the far end of the hallway exploded inward. Not opened. exploded. The sound came first, a percussion burst that echoed off the tile like a detonation. Then the boots. Heavy. Tactical. Organized. 3 figures in full combat gear, faces obscured by balaclavas, weapons raised with the practiced precision of trained operators. But the shouts were in Arabic. The accent was Levantine. The weapons were Kalashnikov platform, not American mil-spec. The alarm started screaming. A code alert broadcast across the hospital intercom. Security was 3 minutes out minimum. The lead attacker's eye scanned the room numbers and locked onto 412. Webb's room. He moved toward it with the confidence of someone executing a planned operation. Sarah's mind didn't process the choice. There was no moment of deliberation, no internal debate about protocol or hospital policy or the fact that she was a civilian nurse who should call security and evacuate. Her body simply moved the way it had moved 1,000 times before, under fire, in places that didn't exist, under orders from people who were now officially dead. She stepped directly into Webb's doorway, blocking it with her frame. "Step back," she said to the attacker, and her voice didn't tremble. It dropped an octave. It sounded like a weapon being cocked. The attacker's weapon came up faster than surprise should have allowed. His training was real. His intention was absolute. Sarah didn't flinch. She threw herself sideways across Webb's unconscious body on the gurney just as the first shot fired, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. The bullet punched through her left shoulder, red-hot and electric, the impact spinning her half around. Pain was information. Pain meant the round had passed through soft tissue, not bone. Survivable. She gasped once, her breath knocked away by impact and adrenaline, and in that single moment of distraction, the second shot came. It grazed the side of her skull, so close she felt the heat off the round, felt the wind of its passage. The world went white. The ringing in her ears was like standing inside an active sonar dome. But muscle memory older than conscious thought was already moving. Sarah's right hand came up and struck the attacker's wrist with the focused precision of an MCMAP Level 3 disarm, redirecting the weapon away from Webb's position. Her left elbow drove upward into the attacker's throat despite the screaming pain in her shoulder, and she used his moment of shock to strip the weapon, rotating it through her hips in a move she'd practiced 10,000 times on training mats in Kandahar and Fort Liberty. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't stutter. The gun came free and she drove the butt of it upward into the attacker's face with controlled force, not rage, not panic, just the calibrated violence of someone who had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury that got people killed. The attacker dropped, blood from his nose and mouth splashing across his tactical vest. Sarah kept the weapon on him, covered Webb's body, and in the space of 90 seconds, the other 2 attackers disengaged and fled out of the ICU. SWAT arrived 2 minutes later to find a heavily wounded nurse still positioned between Webb and the exit, a stolen Kalashnikov held with the kind of steady control that suggested she'd been trained to use it. The security footage was pristine. High definition. It showed everything, her combat-trained movements, her disarm technique, her complete willingness to place her body between the attacker and her patient. It showed her excellence. It showed her competence. It showed exactly what Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was capable of. Dr. Hargrove watched the replay from the security office at 0430 hours, standing in the fluorescent light with his administrative director beside him. He didn't speak during the footage. He barely breathed. He just watched as the nurse he'd tried to destroy neutralized a tactical threat with the precision of someone who'd done it before. The silence in the office lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then he picked up his phone. The security badge deactivation took 12 minutes. The termination letter took 18 minutes. It cited unauthorized physical altercation. It cited reckless endangerment. It cited compromising patient safety through unauthorized use of force. It was technically, legally, perfectly airtight, because the board didn't know that Hargrove himself had been observed at 0300 hours the previous night accessing Webb's for medications, making adjustments to his sedation cocktail without clinical justification, inflating the billing code for a custom compound that would never be analyzed because no one checks what a doctor does at 0300 hours when everyone is asleep. Sarah was handed a cardboard box by the same security guard who usually told her about his daughter's volleyball games. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was a good man who'd just been given orders by the chief financial officer, and orders from CFOs outrank human decency in the institutional hierarchy. She took the box. She was wearing scrubs still stained with her own blood, her left arm in a sling, dried blood matting her hair where the second bullet had creased her skull. The box contained the few personal items she'd accumulated over 12 years of invisibility, a hospital ID badge that was now worthless, a photo of her parents, a pen that someone had given her as a gift whose giver she couldn't remember anymore. She walked out of Mercy General at 0541 hours, as the city was transitioning from night shift to morning shift, and the doors closed behind her with the kind of finality that suggested they might not open again. By noon, a hospital-wide email had been sent praising Dr. Hargrove's decisive action in removing a liability from the facility. Webb opened his eyes at 08 for 7 hours on the second morning after the shooting, and the first thing he saw was not Sarah. It was an empty chair beside his bed where she should have been. His hand went to the call button, but before it got there, he heard the sound that would change everything, the synchronized impact of boots on tile, multiplied and echoing. Not running. Not disorganized. Marching. The footsteps grew louder, more numerous, until the ICU hallway sounded like it had been invaded by an entire battalion. Because it had been. 37 Navy SEALs in dress uniform, standing in two perfect lines from the stairwell to Webb's room, their presence filling the hospital with the kind of pressure that made the fluorescent light seem suddenly inadequate. The lead figure was a captain, weathered in the way that comes from 15 years of operations in places that didn't have names on maps. His trident pin caught the fluorescent light as he walked past security without slowing, without asking permission. It wasn't a request. It was a movement. His voice, when he spoke, dropped every conversation within 50 feet to absolute silence. "We're here for Senior Chief Chen," he said. "Call sign Phantom." 72 hours after the shooting, Sarah walked into the VA hospital wearing a sling that pulled her left shoulder at an angle that made breathing difficult. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and regret, the particular scent of men carrying invisible wounds that no X-ray could diagnose. She signed in under her civilian name. Sat in a plastic chair identical to 100 other plastic chairs in 100 other waiting rooms where she'd once stood in combat fatigues, holding the hands of soldiers who'd just discovered they were still alive. A Navy corpsman passed her without recognition. A Marine with a prosthetic leg nodded at the empty seat beside him. Sarah kept her eyes forward, another broken person with nowhere left to hide, and waited for her name to be called like everyone else waited, like the rank on her medical discharge papers didn't exist, like the 12 years of service erased from every database hadn't actually happened. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 48 hours later when Lieutenant Marcus Webb opened his eyes. The first indication was the sound, boots on tile, not the casual shuffle of hospital staff but the sharp deliberate percussion of military issue, timed and unified. Then came the silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room realizes it's about to change. Sarah was finishing a 0600 medication round when she heard it, when the entire ICU staff froze like deer catching an unfamiliar scent. She didn't need to look. She already knew. 37 Navy SEALs in full dress uniform formed two lines through Mercy General's lobby and down the ICU corridor. Not walking casually. Moving with the terrifying fluid precision of men who'd been trained to occupy space with absolute authority. Their commander, a lieutenant colonel with eyes the color of scorched earth and a voice that made the air pressure change, walked directly past the security desk. Didn't ask permission. Didn't smile. "We're here for Senior Chief Chen. Call sign Phantom. Point us toward the ICU now." The security guard's face went pale. He pointed. Sarah's hands were steady as she hung the last for bag, her composure a 1,000-pound weight pressing down on her ribs, keeping her from shattering. She didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge the footsteps. The silence behind her was the silence before lightning, before everything changed irreversibly. When she finally pivoted from the medication cart, 37 warriors filled the ICU hallway like a physical force, and their commander's eyes found hers across the space between them with the precision of a sniper's scope. "Senior Chief." He nodded. "Formal." "Recognition." Webb's 8-year-old daughter stood beside him, small against the weight of her father's uniform, holding a printed sheet of paper in hands that trembled with the importance of the words she'd been chosen to speak. The ICU fell silent. Nurses stopped charting. A resident paused mid-keystroke. The girl's voice was thin and wavering at first, then strengthened as she read, as if the words themselves gave her power. "Silver Star for Valor in Ramadi." The commander's eyes closed briefly, acknowledging. 2 bronze stars with V device for actions in Kandahar and Fallujah. Another seal touched his chest. The emotion was visible in the geometry of their bodies, shoulders squared, jaws set, the particular stillness that comes from witnessing something sacred. Navy Cross for Operation Copper Valley, where she held a position alone for 7 hours after her team was killed. The little girl's voice cracked slightly. Every SEAL in the hallway stiffened. 43 lives saved under direct enemy fire. The girl finished. Handed the paper to her father. The commander stepped forward, his presence moving through the ICU like a pressure wave, and he gripped Sarah's good shoulder, careful of the wound, with the force of recognition from one warrior to another. "You've been invisible long enough, Senior Chief." Before Hargrove could process what was happening, before he could execute whatever calculation he was making behind those darting eyes, 2 men in NCIS windbreakers appeared at the unit's entrance carrying a tablet and a federal warrant. They moved past the SEALs without hesitation. Dr. Richard Hargrove. The taller agent's voice was flat as concrete. "We need to talk about your 0300 hours visit to room for 0872 hours ago. Specifically, your hands on the medication pumps of a sedated patient. Specifically, why your adjustment increased propofol concentration by 8 mg per kilogram over baseline. Specifically, whether that was a medication error or attempted murder of a federal asset." The blood drained from Hargrove's face. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish dropped onto hot pavement. "I want my attorney." "Of course you do," the second agent said. She pulled up a screen. "We also need to discuss the $1.3 million in fraudulent billing claims across 247 critical care patients over 18 months. The shell company registered to your brother-in-law. The 3 board members you called for favors, they're all cooperating now, by the way. Turns out when the FBI shows up with evidence of kickback schemes, people suddenly remember their loyalty to federal law. Funny how that works." The hospital administrator appeared from his office with the cardboard box already packed, already labeled with Hargrove's name in black marker. The security guard, the same man who'd handed Sarah her termination papers 3 days earlier, took the box from the administrator's hands and walked it directly to Hargrove. His voice was steady, almost pleasant. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Hargrove's designer watch, a $12,000 Omega Seamaster that he'd worn to every shift like armor, caught the fluorescent light one last time as he reached for the box. His hand shook. Actually shook. The man who'd humiliated Sarah in front of families, who'd called her just another diploma mill graduate, whose strategic moves had dismantled her career with the precision of a chess master, was now being escorted out of the building in front of 37 Navy SEALs by hospital security. The patients in the ICU watched. The staff watched. The SEALs watched without expression, witnesses to the consequences of underestimating a warrior. Later, someone would mention that Hargrove had last been spotted setting up a folding table outside a strip mall off the 805, trying to sell supplemental insurance to people waiting for pharmacy refills. His medical license was suspended pending trial. The attorney fees had already forced the sale of his watch and half his portfolio. Karma, it turned out, had an operational speed that bureaucracy could never match. Sarah stood in the center of the ICU hallway as the last of the SEALs moved into formation. Her arms still ached where the bullet had passed through, still throbbed with the particular pain of healing tissue, but the pain was data now, information that she'd survived. That she'd chosen to shield someone and live to tell about it. The commander raised his right hand. 37 other hands rose in unison. The salute came down together with a sound like distant thunder, like respect made physical, like homecoming after a war that had never officially ended. Lieutenant Webb, propped against pillows with chest tubes still draining, extended his worn combat boots, Ramadi-stamped leather, scuffed from desert operations, still carrying actual Iraqi sand in the seams. His voice was rough as gravel. SEAL tradition, senior chief. For someone who earned the right to walk among warriors. Sarah took the boots into her hands. The leather was warm from his hands. The weight of them was almost impossible to carry, not because of her injured shoulder but because of what they meant: recognition, acknowledgement, the return of an identity she'd spent 12 years burying. The trauma resident who'd first recognized her technique in the crisis room stepped forward and gripped her good hand. Kandahar, 2019. I never forgot. You saved my entire patrol. His eyes filled. I'm alive because of you. The chief nursing officer appeared with papers, reinstatement documents, a formal apology printed on hospital letterhead, signed by the administrator and the board. Her position was restored. Back pay was offered. A new title, Associate Director of Trauma Services. Authority. Recognition. The invisible woman made visible at last. Webb's daughter Lily hugged Sarah's waist carefully, avoiding the wound. Daddy says you're the bravest person he knows. Sarah set the boots down on the empty chair beside Webb's bed. She couldn't look at them without something breaking open inside her chest, so she looked instead at the faces of the 37 SEALs, at the commander with his scorched earth eyes, at the NCIS agents already compiling their case against Hargrove, at the hospital staff who'd abandoned her now standing shamefaced in doorways, unable to meet her gaze. She took a measured breath. One. Then another. I need some jello, she said quietly. The trauma resident laughed, actual laughter, and someone moved to get it without being asked. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen reported for duty wearing Lieutenant Commander shoulder boards. Her service record was officially restored. Her rank was recognized not just in SEAL networks but in the hospital system itself, posted on her office door at Mercy General. The VA hospital liaison met with her to coordinate joint trauma training programs. Sarah would teach civilian nurses what combat medicine felt like, would train the next generation of emergency responders in the protocols that kept people alive when everything went wrong. The invisible warrior had become visible at last, stepping into authority like someone reclaiming ground that had always belonged to her. The combat boots sat on her desk in their own place of honor, a physical reminder that some recognitions, once earned, can never be erased. If you've made it this far, you already know the truth about the people around you, the ones who disappear into their work, who carry invisible weight, who've learned to survive by being underestimated. The Sarah Chens of the world don't need validation to know their value, but they deserve to have it anyway. Like and subscribe for more stories about the warriors we walk past every day, and comment below, who's the quiet person in your life who's probably stronger than you know? Because not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs.